The old, abandoned Blackwood Sanatorium loomed ahead of us like a haunted castle in a horror movie. It was an ominous structure, half consumed by nature, with ivy snaking up its walls and broken windows that resembled the empty eye sockets of a skull. The night sky was overcast, casting a gloomy pall over everything. My friends and I had always considered ourselves adventurous, but this felt different. This place had a history, a dark one, filled with tales of horrific medical experiments and unexplained disappearances. We pushed open the rusted iron gates, which creaked loudly as if protesting our intrusion. The sound echoed eerily in the silence of the night. Our flashlights cut through the thick darkness as we made our way up the cracked, overgrown pathway leading to the main entrance. The doors were barely hanging on their hinges, and it took a combined effort to push them open. The smell of mold and decay hit us immediately, and I had to cover my nose to keep from gagging. Inside the sanatorium was a labyrinth of decaying corridors and forgotten rooms. Peeling wallpaper revealed layers of neglect, and the floors were littered with debris. We walked carefully, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous hallways. Every now and then, we came across old medical equipment, rusted and covered in dust, like relics from another era. There were faded, disturbing graffiti on the walls, left by previous explorers or perhaps former patients. Messages like "Help us" and "They're watching" sent chills down my spine. We eventually reached the basement, where the most notorious experiments were rumored to have taken place. The air was colder here, and the darkness seemed even more oppressive. As we navigated the narrow, claustrophobic passages, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My flashlight flickered, adding to my growing sense of unease. Then we saw it. A shadowy figure, hunched and cloaked, standing in the far corner of the basement. It was barely visible in the dim light, but there was something undeniably menacing about it. The figure was muttering something incoherent, words that sounded like a twisted mixture of pleading and warning. My friend Mark, always the bravest among us, decided to approach. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. But as he took a step forward, the figure suddenly disappeared, as if swallowed by the darkness itself. We stood there, frozen in shock and confusion. The air around us seemed to grow even colder, and an unexplainable sense of dread filled the room. We decided to head back upstairs, but as we climbed the stairs, we heard it. Faint but unmistakable sounds of movement above us. Footsteps, creaking floorboards, and what sounded like nails scratching against wood. We exchanged nervous glances but felt compelled to investigate. The noises led us to the second floor, where the patient rooms were located. These rooms were filled with old medical files and patient records, documenting the gruesome experiments that had taken place. Reading through them, I felt a sickening mix of horror and pity. These weren't just patients. They were victims of sadistic doctors who had turned the sanatorium into a house of nightmares. Suddenly, a figure emerged from one of the rooms. It was a woman, her face a twisted mask of rage and pain covered in scars. Her eyes were wild, filled with a desperate, almost animalistic intensity. She let out a guttural scream and started towards us, her movements erratic and uncoordinated but terrifyingly determined. Panic set in, and we bolted. The chase through the dark, decaying hallways was a blur of fear and adrenaline. Every time I glanced back, she was right there, always just a few steps behind. We reached a room with a broken window and didn't hesitate. One by one, we scrambled through, cutting ourselves on the jagged glass but too terrified to care. Once outside, we ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. We collapsed on the ground, trying to catch our breath and make sense of what had just happened. It was only then that we began to piece together the puzzle. The records, the figure in the basement, and the woman. They were all connected. The figure we saw in the basement, we realized, might have been a surviving patient, someone who had endured the horrors of Blackwood and was trying to warn us. The woman who chased us, scarred and enraged, was likely another victim, driven mad by the experiments. In the end, we left Blackwood Sanatorium with more questions than answers, haunted by the knowledge that some horrors never truly die. I've always had a fascination with urban exploration, so when I heard about the abandoned doll factory on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist. It had been shut down decades ago after a mysterious fire, and no one had ventured inside since. Armed with my camera, I decided to document the eerie remnants of the place. I arrived just as the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the decrepit building. The factory loomed before me, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring out into the night. As I stepped inside, the air grew colder, carrying a strange, oppressive atmosphere that made my skin crawl. The interior was a wasteland of burnt machinery and charred dolls, their once innocent faces now twisted and blackened. I started snapping photos, the flash of my camera illuminating the haunting scene for brief moments. Each click echoed in the silent, decaying space, amplifying my sense of isolation. After taking dozens of photos, I decided to review them on my camera. That's when I noticed something odd. Some of the dolls seemed to have shifted positions between shots. A chill ran down my spine. I was sure I was alone, but the thought of the dolls moving on their own was deeply unsettling. Determined to shake off the unease, I continued exploring. Suddenly, I heard the faint sound of footsteps and the eerie giggle of children. My heart pounded as I spun around, finding nothing but empty halls. The sounds seemed to follow me, growing louder and more distinct. Despite every logical part of my brain telling me it was impossible, I felt the undeniable presence of someone or something watching me. I stumbled into an old assembly room, drawn by a faint light flickering in the corner. There, among the dusty tables and forgotten tools, was a shadow darting across the wall. I hesitated, but then followed the shadow, my curiosity overpowering my fear. I found a section of the factory that looked untouched by time, with rows of pristine dolls lined up perfectly. At the end of the room was a table covered with ancient, rusted tools. It looked as if someone had just stepped away from their work. My pulse quickened as I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but my feet seemed glued to the spot. Suddenly, the dolls started moving, their glassy eyes turning to me in unison. Among them stood a small figure, a child with a sinister smile. It moved towards me with an unnatural grace. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the nearest exit, the sound of rustling dolls and whispered voices filling the air. I could hear my name being called in soft, menacing tones. I raced through the dark corridors, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and finally found an emergency exit. Bursting through the door, I left my equipment behind and ran to my car, not stopping until I was miles away. Back at my studio, the nightmare continued. I tried to make sense of what had happened, diving into the factory's history. I discovered that the owner's daughter had vanished the night of the fire, her body never found. The factory had been rumored to be cursed ever since. Days later, I started receiving anonymous messages. They contained photos of the factory, but more disturbingly, of the dolls inside. Each photo was a close-up of a doll's face, and in the reflection of their glassy eyes, I saw myself, captured in my moment of terror. The final message sent a chill through my very core. Come back. She's waiting for you. Every night, I dream of that sinister smile and hear those whispers, knowing that something from that factory has followed me. The sense of dread never leaves. A constant reminder of the night I entered the haunted doll factory. You know, it all started as a simple plan. Just a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the mountains, away from the noise and chaos of the city. We were 4 friends, looking for peace, adventure, and maybe a few ghost stories around the campfire. The journey there was uneventful, but as we got closer to the cabin, it became clear how isolated we were. The place was charming, no doubt about it. Rustic wooden beams, a stone fireplace, a breathtaking view of the mountains. But there was something strange about it. The cabin had an unsettling vibe, as if it had been hastily abandoned. There were cobwebs in the corners and a thick layer of dust on the furniture. We didn't think much of it at first. Perhaps it had only been a while since our last visit. After unpacking, we decided to explore a bit. That's when things started to get strange. Near the campfire, we found a circle of stones with still hot ashes, and there were personal items scattered around. An old backpack, a book, a half-burned photograph. It was as if someone had been there recently and simply disappeared. That first night, real unease set in. We were sitting around the fire, sharing stories and drinking beers, when we started to hear noises. They weren't the usual forest sounds. They were different. We could hear branches breaking and low murmurs. They sounded like whispers, but we couldn't understand the words. We tried to ignore it, attributing it to the wind or the animals, but deep down we knew something was wrong. The next morning, things got worse. Mark, one of my friends, found fresh footprints around the hut. They weren't ours. And some of our food supplies had disappeared. We felt like we were being watched. Then Sarah made the scariest discovery of all. A hidden camera in the bedroom. Someone was spying on us. Our cozy refuge was turning into a nightmare. We panicked, We decided to leave and get help. We thought that splitting up would cover more ground and get us out of there faster. Bad idea. Shortly after we separated, we heard a scream. It was Mike. We ran towards the sound and found him on the ground, badly injured. He had been attacked by a man, dirty, with a wild, demented look in his eyes. We managed to pull him away and get Mike back to the hut, but he was badly hurt. Back at the hut, we knew we had to defend ourselves. We locked all the doors and windows and armed ourselves with whatever we could find: kitchen knives, a fireplace poker, even some heavy candlesticks. As night fell, the tension was unbearable. We could hear him outside, circling the hut, trying to get in. The attack came around midnight. He broke a window and tried to get in. It was chaos. Screaming, fighting, blood. We fought with all our might, driven by adrenaline. Somehow, we managed to overpower him, but not without getting hurt. Sarah had a nasty cut on her arm, and Mark was almost unconscious from blood loss. By dawn, we were a wreck, exhausted, injured, traumatized. That's when we heard voices again, but this time they were real. A search and rescue team, calling our names. They were looking for us after a distress call from a hiker nearby who heard our screams. It turned out that our assailant was a fugitive, wanted for several crimes. We were lucky to be alive. We left that cabin in the mountains behind, but the terror of that weekend will never leave us. It's strange how such a beautiful place can hide so much darkness. We went in search of an escape from reality and found ourselves trapped in a real-life horror story.